Before you judge what I am about to say, let me ask you something simple. If you were standing in front of a door that could change your country's future, and behind that door were money, approval, and international support, would you still be willing to walk in and say no? Most leaders are trained to move quickly through such doors. Silence is treated as weakness. Pausing is seen as hesitation, and certainty is expected to come from numbers, not from conscience. But that morning, I stopped. Not because I was unsure, not because I lacked preparation. I stopped because I knew that once a leader enters a room with fear in his heart, every decision that follows becomes a negotiation with that fear. Before any title, before any uniform, before anyone calls me president, I am a man who must answer to his conscience and to God. But I come from a country that does not appear often in American headlines. We are not known for financial power or global influence, but we are known by something far more demanding. Ordinary people who wake up every morning and choose dignity even when life is heavy. Farmers who keep working land that barely forgives their effort. Parents who stretch a week's income across a month of needs. Young people who still believe that their future is worth staying for. I carry their lives into every room I enter. And I also carry something else, my own doubt, my own fear, and my faith. That morning, before stepping into a meeting that could reshape our economic path, I did not open a briefing file. I did not review talking points. I did not ask my advisors for one last strategic calculation. I chose silence, but not the kind of silence that avoids responsibility, but the kind that removes noise from the heart. In that quiet moment, I prayed to Jesus Christ, not for victory, not for persuasive words, not for advantage. I asked only for clarity, for honesty, and for the courage to refuse what should never be accepted, no matter how attractive it might look on paper. Something settled inside me. The pressure did not disappear. The stakes did not shrink. But the fear lost its authority. And when fear steps aside, a leader finally becomes free enough to protect people instead of negotiating their future away. That is where this story truly begins. The meeting itself was not unusual. A long table, prepared documents, carefully chosen words, professional smiles that reveal nothing and promise even less. For decades, conversations like this have followed a familiar rhythm in countries like mine. Data is presented, scenarios are explained, options are framed in polite language, and pressure arrives quietly, disguised as technical necessity. To an American audience, this may sound distant, but the logic is not unfamiliar. It is the same logic many communities recognize when decisions are made far away, in rooms they will never enter, while the consequences arrive at their doors anyway. Behind that closed door were officials, advisors, translators, and expectations formed long before I walked down that corridor. I remember the hallway clearly. Government buildings have a special kind of silence. Footsteps sound heavier than they should. Even the air feels like it carries the memory of past negotiations. Promises made, compromises buried, and outcomes explained later with careful language. The door was only a few steps ahead of me. I stopped, not visibly, not in a way that would attract attention, but inwardly. For years, leaders are taught that strength is shown by speed, by confidence, by entering rooms without hesitation. We are trained to believe that momentum is power, that pausing invites doubt, that silence creates vulnerability. But in that moment, I understood something different. If I entered that room carrying the noise of urgency, expectation, and external pressure, I would leave it carrying obligations that were never meant for my people. So I closed my eyes, not outwardly, but within myself. I did not reach for my phone. I did not turn to my advisors. I did not rehearse a single line. But I spoke to Jesus Christ in the simplest way a man can speak when no audience is listening. I did not ask for success. I did not ask to win. I asked not to betray the poor quietly, not to sell the future politely, not to exchange dignity for approval. I asked to be protected from clever compromises, the kind that sound responsible in press releases, but leave wounds that remain long after the signatures fade. There was nothing emotional about it. It was grounding. When I finished, I noticed something that surprised me. My shoulders had relaxed. My breathing had slowed. The familiar tension that surrounds high-stakes meetings had dissolved. The seriousness of what waited behind that door was still there. But it no longer felt heavy. It felt clear. In that pause, I realized something I had never learned in any briefing. The most important threshold of the day was not the door in front of me. It was the line inside me. If I crossed that line carrying fear, I would negotiate like someone asking permission. If I crossed it carrying clarity, I would speak like someone entrusted with responsibility. I stood there only for a moment, but the decision was already complete, and only then did I reach for the door. When I stepped into the room, nothing looked different. The table was polished. The flags were arranged with quiet precision. Folders were stacked as if order itself could guarantee a good outcome. Faces turned toward me with professional attention. Some smiled. Some simply observed. Everyone was ready. What had changed was not the room, it was me. The clarity that came after that moment of prayer did not feel dramatic, and it did not arrive like a revelation. It arrived like a decision that no longer needs to argue with itself. I took my seat and folded my hands lightly on the table, and I listened. Not because I was unsure, not because I was waiting to react, but because real leadership begins by understanding exactly what is being placed in front of you. The proposals were presented carefully. They always are. Words like efficiency, stability, confidence, and long-term resilience move easily across international tables. They sound reassuring. They sound responsible. The logic is clean. But I have learned that clean logic can still produce painful outcomes. As I listened, I did not measure the ideas against political convenience. I measured them against daily life, against the small, a fragile margin that separates survival from collapse for millions of families. I could already see the familiar patterns hidden beneath the professional language. Adjust spending. Restructure essential sectors. Reduce support where budgets feel pressure first. On paper, it looks reasonable. In real life, it looks like something very different. It looks like a farmer standing in line for fuel that determines whether food reaches the market at all. It looks like a mother quietly deciding which meal can be skipped so school fees can be paid. It looks like a clinic deciding which services must disappear because funding tightened responsibly. These are not emotional exaggerations. They are predictable outcomes. That morning, the numbers that once might have felt overwhelming no longer carried authority over me. It's not because money does not matter, but because clarity changes how you see it. I understood something very simply and very firmly. Short-term relief often carries long-term obedience hidden inside it. Some offers arrive as support. Some arrive as partnership. Some arrive as opportunity. But when dependence becomes structural, choice slowly disappears, and a nation that cannot choose its own pace eventually loses the ability to choose its own future. I did not interrupt. I allowed every proposal to be explained fully. And as I listened, I noticed something subtle. Because I was not searching for approval, I could hear more clearly. I could separate concern from habit, advice from assumption, experience from repetition. Some of what was said came from genuine belief in a model that has worked elsewhere. But repetition does not make a model just, and it does not make it universal. The clarity I carried did not make me aggressive. It made me precise. I knew exactly where the lines were, and because of that, I did not need to defend them loudly. The rhythm of the room began to change. Sentences slowed. Recommendations were framed more carefully. Advisors glanced at one another more often than usual. Not because anyone was confused, but because the room was adjusting. They were accustomed to resistance driven by urgency. They were accustomed to leaders negotiating from a position of fear. They were not accustomed to refusal that comes from certainty. My calm was not a tactic. It was the natural result of having already decided what could never be placed on the table. And that unsettled the pattern. Not through confrontation, but through quiet stability. As the discussion moved from general principles to concrete measures, the atmosphere shifted again. This is always the moment when words begin to carry weight. When each sentence quietly asks a leader to choose between appearing cooperative and remaining faithful to the people who will never sit in that room. The arguments were coherent. The language was professional. The reasoning was disciplined. But discipline without compassion becomes mechanical. When my turn came to speak, I did not raise my voice. I spoke slowly. I said that certain measures, regardless of how reasonable they appear in reports, would place an unacceptable burden on families who already live close to the edge. I said that food security is not an adjustable variable, and I said that access to essential services is not a temporary inconvenience to be corrected later. I said that sovereignty over basic decisions is not a technical detail. And then I said one simple word. No. Not defiantly. Not emotionally. Just clearly. Not because cooperation is wrong, but because some forms of cooperation quietly transfer responsibility away from those who must live with the consequences. I expected, perhaps out of habit, pressure to follow. A warning, a reminder, a suggestion to reconsider. That is how these moments usually unfold. But it did not happen. There was a pause, a real one. Notes were adjusted. A sentence was reshaped before being spoken. And in that stillness, something important became visible. When conscience is not presented as a position to be negotiated, while it stops being useful as leverage, it becomes a boundary. And boundaries, when held calmly, tend to be respected. The conversation did not escalate. It recalibrated. Instead of insisting on predetermined steps, questions became open. Instead of emphasizing timelines and benchmarks, priorities and limits were discussed. For the first time that day, I noticed something rare in rooms like this. Not agreement, not concession, but genuine attention. The room stopped assuming weakness. It stopped treating resistance as temporary. It began to recognize that it was facing a government that was not waiting to be rescued. And a leader who does not see himself as fragile cannot be quietly managed through fear. That realization changes how dialogue unfolds. When a nation enters negotiations believing it has no alternative, and every conversation becomes about survival. When a nation enters knowing it can walk away, conversations become about alignment. That distinction changes everything. From that moment on, the conversation no longer revolved around what we were willing to surrender. It began to revolve around what we were willing to build. Not defensively, not as a reaction, but as a statement of direction. I spoke calmly about limits, not political limits, human limits, about how much pressure ordinary families can absorb before stability becomes a word that only appears in reports. I explained that food security is not a policy lever. It is a line of survival. That education is not an expense to be delayed until conditions improve. It is the condition that allows improvement to exist at all. That health services are not a future investment. They are a present necessity. And that a nation's ability to decide its own priorities is not a privilege granted after compliance. It is the foundation of responsible partnership. I did not frame these points as moral demands. I framed them as practical reality. Because dignity is not abstract. It shows up in attendance at school, in whether medicine reaches clinics on time, in whether parents can plan more than 1 week ahead. I could feel the tone in the room soften without becoming weaker. There is a difference. Weakness invites control. Clarity invites adjustment. Instead of returning again and again to predetermined measures, the discussion began to move toward questions. What reforms can be phased rather than imposed? Which sectors require protection before restructuring? How can stability be pursued without damaging the social fabric that holds communities together? These were not dramatic shifts. They were subtle, but they mattered. Because the room was no longer asking how far pressure could go. It was asking how far understanding needed to go. This is what happens when fear is removed from the table, not only from one side, from the entire conversation. For many years, countries like mine have been told, quietly and repeatedly, that sovereignty must be earned later, after growth, after compliance, after patience, after alignment with external expectations. That day, I understood something that had always been presented backwards. Sovereignty does not arrive as a reward. It begins the moment fear stops deciding for you. When fear governs a negotiation, compromise feels like survival. But when clarity governs a negotiation, compromise must compete with responsibility. That is not stubbornness. It is stewardship. We began to speak openly about our own path forward, not as a defensive posture, but as a choice. I explained that we intend to pursue self-reliance gradually, not as isolation, not as rejection of cooperation, but as protection against permanent dependence. I spoke about debt carefully, not as something immoral, but as something dangerous when it becomes structural and unavoidable. I spoke about partnerships that respect pace and context, rather than impose speed and uniform solutions. None of this was radical. It was measured. But it rested on one assumption that quietly reorders power. Dignity is not a luxury to be added after growth. It is a condition without which growth becomes hollow. While the room adjusted again, not through a public declaration, not through a breakthrough moment, but through acceptance that the usual framework could not be applied unchanged. I noticed the clock. Not because I wanted the meeting to end, but because something unusual was happening. Time was no longer being used as pressure. The agenda that normally stretches for hours began to resolve naturally, not rushed, not dismissed, but settled. Once it became clear that certain conditions would not be accepted, no one attempted to return to them later. No strategic postponement. No quiet reintroduction. The conversation simply moved forward. That rarely happens when leverage still works. Normally, endurance is part of the process. Fatigue becomes a tool. Agreement often arrives after resistance has been worn down. That day, my endurance was unnecessary, because the leverage they expected to use no longer existed. A country that believes it has no alternative negotiates from survival. A country that knows it can walk away negotiates from alignment. And alignment does not require pressure, only mutual clarity. I did not speak about faith during that meeting. I did not quote scripture. I did not explain my prayer. I did not mention Jesus Christ. And yet faith shaped every decision I made in that room. Not as language, as posture. Not as persuasion, as consistency. I did not adjust my tone when resistance appeared. I did not soften my principles when the atmosphere became more careful. I did not harden my words to project strength. I remained the same. That steadiness is rare in spaces built around power. In rooms like that, leaders often change unconsciously. We speak one way when pressure rises, another when it falls. We calculate reactions. We test boundaries. We adapt constantly. That adaptation can be felt, even when it is invisible. And instability invites manipulation. Faith removes that instability. Because I was not relying on my own cleverness to navigate the meeting, I did not need to reshape myself to fit the room. I allowed the room to adjust to the truth I carried. That truth was simple. My responsibility was not to secure approval. It was to protect people, not numbers, not models, not reputations. People. I could sense that this steadiness affected more than the discussion itself. My advisors noticed it. The translators noticed it. Even the visiting delegation adjusted their posture slightly, as if the tone of the room had been set by something deeper than negotiation. This is how faith becomes collective strength, not by convincing others to believe what you believe, but by removing fear from the space. When fear leaves, clarity follows, and when clarity appears, even disagreement becomes honest. I have learned something important about leadership. Faith does not make decisions easier. It makes them cleaner. It removes false options, the ones created by fear of disappointment, fear of isolation, fear of being misunderstood by powerful institutions. Those options disappear the moment you decide, long before any crisis arrives, which lines you will never cross. Even if crossing them would bring applause, even if crossing them would bring funding, even if crossing them would bring immediate relief, that alignment creates freedom. In that meeting, I did not feel free because I had authority. I felt free because I had limits. I knew what did not belong to me to trade. I knew what could never be placed on a negotiation table. No office, no loan, no partnership. Is worth the quiet betrayal of people who trust their future to your decisions. I have seen what happens when leaders place power first. Power demands constant feeding. It asks for reassurance, for loyalty, for appearances, for results that can be presented cleanly. When power comes first, every decision is filtered through one silent question. How will this affect my position? Even when the leader sincerely believes he is serving the public good. When God comes first, the questions change. They become simpler and far more demanding. Is this right? Or not profitable, not popular, not defensible in institutional language, simply right. A leader who is not anchored in conscience will eventually be ruled by figures on paper. Forecasts become louder than hunger. Projections become more convincing than pain. Promises of future stability begin to outweigh present suffering. Not because leaders are cruel, but because they are afraid. Fear is the most expensive advisor in any room. There is a widespread belief, especially in international affairs, that power is final, that financial systems determine what is possible, that markets punish disobedience, that established frameworks cannot be resisted without severe consequences. I understand why many people believe this. These systems are large. Their reach is global. Their influence is real, but it is not absolute. I have learned something quietly important. Systems are powerful only when fear cooperates with them. They depend on quiet consent, on the belief that there is no alternative, on the assumption that resistance is irresponsible. Once that belief is questioned, authority shrinks to its true size. God's authority works differently. It does not rush. It does not threaten. It does not rely on enforcement. It operates through truth. And truth has an unusual quality. It does not need to win arguments to prevail. It only needs to be lived consistently. That is what unsettles systems built on compliance. Not protest, not confrontation, but calm refusal rooted in conscience. That day, I did not challenge power. I simply refused to treat it as ultimate. And that quiet refusal changed the room. When the meeting ended, there was no sense of victory, no breakthrough to announce, no dramatic agreement to celebrate, no headline waiting to be written. There was only quiet. And that quiet mattered to me, because it told me something important. I had not traded clarity for approval. I had not softened responsibility in order to appear cooperative. I had not betrayed myself in order to appear successful. The most meaningful outcomes of leadership rarely arrive as public events. They appear later, in classrooms that remain open, in clinics that continue to serve, in families who are not forced to absorb one more silent shock created far away from their lives. No one outside that room would ever know what was proposed. No one would ever know which conditions were declined. And that is how it should be. But leadership is not meant to be experienced as spectacle. It is meant to be felt as protection. For many countries like mine, we are told, repeatedly, that sovereignty must come later, after growth, after approval, after patience, after we have proven that we can be trusted with it. That day taught me something I will carry into every room I enter. Sovereignty begins when fear is removed from decision-making, not when funding arrives, not when institutions endorse your direction, but when a leader becomes willing to walk away from what would cost too much to accept. Faith is not a shield that protects leaders from difficulty. It is a compass that keeps them from becoming lost inside it. And I learned something deeply personal. I did not feel strong because others listened, and I felt steady because I had already decided who I was responsible to. I think often about the people who will never hear about that meeting. Farmers, teachers, shop owners, parents. They will never read the documents. They will never know the language that shaped those conversations. They will only know, slowly and quietly, whether life became harder than it needed to be, or whether dignity was protected when no one was watching. To those of you listening in the United States, I speak to you with respect. You live inside one of the most powerful systems ever created. You understand better than most how quickly certainty can collapse. You have seen institutions praised and later questioned. You have seen leaders rise and fall. You have watched confidence turn into confusion. You know that competence matters. Well, but you also know that competence without conscience is not enough. This is not a story about one country, and it is not a story about one meeting. It is a story about something much closer to home. Every society, including yours, eventually reaches moments when the most reasonable choice is not the right one. When the most efficient solution quietly abandons people who cannot defend themselves. When stability is protected by pushing risk downward onto those who already carry too much. In those moments, systems will not save you. Only people will. And people act differently when they are no longer ruled by fear. I am not asking you to agree with every decision I will ever make. I am not asking you to share my faith. I am asking you to remember one simple truth. The future is shaped less by brilliant strategies than by quiet boundaries that refuse to move. When leaders place God above money, above reputation, above access, and above influence, something powerful but invisible begins to happen. Decisions become cleaner, harm becomes harder to justify, and dignity, once protected, becomes contagious. The world does not need louder voices. It needs more leaders who are willing to pause before doors, who are willing to listen before speaking, and who are willing to refuse before betraying what cannot be replaced. I carry no illusion that this path is easy, but I carry no doubt that it is right. Before any title, before any authority, before any recognition, I remain accountable to my conscience and to God. And that accountability, more than any agreement I could sign, that is what allows me to stand without trembling when powerful doors open in front of me. If you take anything from this story, do not take the setting. Do not take the names. Do not take the geography. Take the principle. Because what happened in that room is not unique to presidents. It happens in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in hospitals, in classrooms, in city councils, in companies that quietly shape entire communities. It happens whenever a decision affects people who will never sit at the table. In your country, power does not always look like a uniform or a flag. Often it looks like influence, capital, technology, market access, reputation. But the question is always the same. When the numbers make sense, when the experts agree, when the outcome protects your position, will anyone still ask the simplest and hardest question? Is this right? Not legal, not efficient, not defensible. Right. I have learned that the most dangerous moment in leadership is not crisis. It is comfort. It is the moment when success begins to feel normal and conscience begins to feel inconvenient. That is when quiet harm becomes easy. And that is when silence becomes a decision. To my Muslim brothers and sisters who are listening, I say this with respect. Righteousness is not weakened by dialogue, and dignity is not lost by standing firm. Justice belongs to God, and those who seek it sincerely are never abandoned, even when the road becomes narrow. To my Christian brothers and sisters, especially those who carry the name of Jesus in their hearts, I say this. Faith is not proven by public declarations. It is proven by private obedience. Christ did not teach us to fear powerful systems. He taught us to serve truth. When leaders learn how to kneel in private, they can stand in public without trembling. And to every person watching from the United States, whether you lead a nation, a company, a team, a family, or only your own life, I leave you with this. You do not need more information. You do not need better arguments. You need clarity about what you will never trade. Long before the pressure comes, long before the door opens, long before anyone is watching. Because when your boundaries are decided in advance, fear loses its leverage. And when fear loses its leverage, even the most powerful systems discover limits they cannot cross. I do not speak as a symbol. I speak as a man. Power passes. Titles fade. Institutions rise and fall. But the people who carry the cost of our decisions remain. History does not remember how clever our agreements were. It remembers whether we protected the vulnerable when no applause was waiting for us. May wisdom guide you. May courage steady you. And may God keep you aligned with what is right, long after the doors close and the rooms fall silent. If these words stirred something you recognize, not agreement, but memory, do not let that moment pass unnoticed. Carry it into the next decision that asks you to choose between comfort and conscience, between silence and responsibility, between what is easy and what is right. Stay part of this conversation, not for attention, not for performance, but for understanding. Because the world rarely changes through noise, and it changes when ordinary people, in powerful places and in quiet ones, decide in advance what they will never trade. I am not writing this to be remembered. I am writing it so that, when your own moment comes, when the door is closed, the pressure is real, and no one will ever know what you chose, you will remember that courage is not loud. It is decided quietly. Before the door opens, and when history looks back, it will not ask how powerful you were. It will ask how carefully you protected the people who had no power at all.